I never planned to become the center of a neighborhood war. All I ever wanted after retiring from the state's Department of Environmental Protection was a quiet life. The kind that comes with early sunrises shimmering across still water loons, echoing in the morning mist, and the gentle slap of lake water against a wooden dock. I earned it. After 31 years of enforcing conservation laws, inspecting water systems, and testifying in court against land developers who thought rules were optional, all I wanted was peace, and so I bought it. 2 acres of shoreline and forest tucked into the northeastern corner of Alderwood County, with a private natural lake that wrapped around my land like a silvery horseshoe. My lake wasn't large, but it was deep, spring-fed, and legally protected. I purchased it in 1999, along with the parcel that included a crumbling old boathouse, a dock, and enough land to build my modest 1-story home with wraparound windows and a screened-in porch facing the water. I even kept the old name carved into the wooden arch over the path to the dock Davenport's elbow. Locals told me it was named after some Civil War veteran who used to fish there. I liked that. A quiet legend on quiet water. For over 2 decades, life was good. Simple. Every spring, I cleared the brush by hand, maintained the trails, and restocked the native fish in the lake from licensed hatcheries. I hosted the occasional canoe club and taught local kids how to identify frog calls. No jet skis, no big parties, no one but me and the land. Then came the survey markers. At first, I thought someone had accidentally left the fluorescent orange flags behind those little plastic triangles flapping in the breeze poked into my northern tree line like unnatural flowers. I yanked them out and tossed them in my garage. But the next week, there were more. This time with spray-painted stakes. Then came a pair of men in hard hats, walking along the North Ridge, looking through the trees down at my lake as if it belonged to them. "Can I help you?" I asked from the edge of my porch, coffee in hand, voice flat. One of them waved. "Just surveying for a new community project. HOA's expanding into the old Hollis property. Shouldn't affect you, sir, but I already knew it would." I'd heard about the Hollis sale. An old cattle farm turned derelict, then auctioned and snapped up by a development group calling itself Meadow Hills. They had big plans, a luxury gated community with shared lake access, a clubhouse, and nature trails. Problem was, the shared lake didn't exist. Not legally. Not unless they thought they could bully their way into mine. It started small mailers from the Meadow Hills HOA, offering to welcome neighboring properties into the community. I didn't respond. Then came the emails. Then the uninvited visits. "We believe collaboration is the future of modern living," said the young woman in a pale blue blazer standing on my porch. "You have an incredible resource here. We'd love to make the lake a central amenity for the neighborhood." I smiled, but not kindly. "It's not yours to make central." Her smile stiffened. "But surely you're open to a partnership." I pointed at the deed hanging in a frame above my fireplace. "It's mine. Fully private. Protected by state conservation law." "Well," she said, adjusting her jacket, "sometimes deeds can be outdated." I knew then this wouldn't be the last time I saw her. By late spring, I heard the whir of heavy machinery through the trees. Trucks arrived daily at the Hollis site bringing lumber, concrete, fencing. From my dock, I could see the steel skeleton of a structure rising just beyond the property line, a large pavilion with a deck that jutted out like a finger pointing at the water. They didn't even pretend it wasn't for lake use. I could see picnic tables, a kayak launch, and signs advertising community shoreline access. But the shoreline they were pointing to wasn't theirs. It was mine. The trees they were cutting down for better lake views were rooted on my land. The soil they were shifting redirected runoff into my fish hatch channel. I contacted the county. I submitted written complaints. I sent copies of my title maps and even GPS coordinates, but the clerk just shrugged. They filed for a recreational structure permit under their own development parcel. "Unless you can prove it crosses your boundary, there's not much we can do." "I can prove it," I replied, pulling out the survey I'd paid for in 2003, stamped by a licensed state surveyor. "I can show you every inch of where my property ends and theirs begins." "Well then," she said almost reluctantly, "you'll probably want to get a lawyer." That night, I stood at the edge of my dock, looking out at the half-finished monstrosity rising like a wart on the shoreline. I felt something I hadn't felt since my enforcement days, a slow cold burn in my gut. Not fear, no, I'd seen too much for that, but a steady righteous fury. I hadn't spent my life protecting natural resources from corruption just to watch some overfunded HOA flatten my woods and dump picnic goers on my dock. They thought I was a retired old man with too much free time. They were about to learn how dangerous that could be. The next morning, I drove into town and parked in front of the Alderwood County Recorder's office, a modest brick building sandwiched between the fire station and the old diner where I used to grab coffee during fieldwork back in the day. I knew the layout by heart. In less than 10 minutes, I'd found the most recent filings for the Meadow Hills development. I requested full parcel records, easements, construction permits, anything that might show how this HOA believed they had the right to build that monstrosity beside my lake. The clerk, a woman named Jamie, who looked like she could still remember me from the early 2000s, raised an eyebrow when she saw the volume of documents I requested. "Someone rattled your piece, huh?" I gave her a slow nod. "They're building on land they don't own, and they're doing it with confidence." Jamie's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Well, according to what I see here, Meadow Hills owns the Hollis tract about 42 acres to the north of your property. No easements registered. Nothing that touches the water." I felt a small surge of vindication. "And the building plans?" She pulled them up. "Looks like they submitted blueprints for a community gathering facility with water access amenities." Huh. This drawing here shows a dock kayak launch, and wait a second, this line right here crosses parcel 109B. That's not their land, is it? "No," I said flatly. "That's mine." Jamie looked up from the screen. "Then they're building illegally." "Exactly." I thanked her and left with a folder full of printouts and digital scans. Back home, I spread them across my dining table, layering my original property, survey the Meadow Hills site plan, and aerial images from the county GIS database. It was blatant. Their new deck and the path leading to it spilled a full 30 feet over the line onto my property. Worse, they'd cleared a section of shoreline vegetation, protected under state wetland preservation guidelines. If I hadn't seen it myself, I would have thought they were just clumsy. But this was intentional. That same afternoon, I called the Meadow Hills HOA office. The receptionist transferred me to someone named Karen Holt, the HOA's Director of Community Enrichment. "Mr. Davenport," she said with a cheerfully smug tone, "what can I do for you?" "You can stop building your little lake playground on my property, for starters." A brief silence, then a cough. "I'm afraid I don't understand." I laid it out. The parcel numbers, the surveys, the lack of easement, the wetlands, violations, the runoff damage, the illegal signage. I could almost hear her fidgeting. Well, Karen finally said, "We've consulted with our developer and legal team, and they assured us the structure falls within our boundaries." "You're wrong," I said. "And if you keep pushing this, you're going to find yourselves at the wrong end of a demolition order from the State Water Board." Karen's tone hardened. "Mr. Davenport, if you persist in making baseless accusations, we may need to involve legal counsel." I almost laughed. "Please do." That evening, a glossy newsletter showed up in my mailbox. It was from the Meadow Hills HOA, addressed to residents of the lakeside community. On the front was a full-color rendering of the new lake pavilion, complete with community picnic areas, paddleboard rentals, and a banner that read, "Coming Summer 2005. Your lake, your life." I didn't know whether to be offended or amused. Your lake. They were so used to muscling their way through opposition that they hadn't stopped to ask if the lake was even public. The next week, the trucks returned, this time pouring concrete for the deck pilings. I stood at the boundary line, watching the cement truck back in its spinning drum churning under the sun like a stomach full of wrong. I crossed the tree line and stepped into view. One of the workers spotted me. "Hey, you can't be on site." I pointed to the surveyor's ribbon tied to the stake at my feet. "You're standing on my land." He hesitated, then muttered, "Talk to the board," and walked off. So I did. The next Meadow Hills HOA board meeting was held in their sales center, a prefab building wrapped in promotional posters and artificial smiles. I wore my old field jacket, the one with my faded state badge, stitched onto the sleeve, not because I wanted to intimidate them, but because I knew the kind of respect people give a uniform, even when it's old. There were 6 board members at the front table, all in matching polo shirts. Karen Holt sat in the middle, flanked by a woman scribbling notes and a man who looked like he'd been born angry. I waited until the public comment section and then stood. My name is Walter Davenport. I'm the owner of Parcel 199B, which borders your development. For the last month, your contractors have been clearing trees, pouring concrete, and building a structure that extends over 30 feet into my property. Karen leaned forward, smiling like a PR puppet. Mr. Davenport, we've already addressed this through our internal process. Our legal counsel has reviewed the property lines and confirmed we're within rights. Incorrect, I said sharply. I have survey records from both the county and the state, including GIS overlays and GPS data. I've also spoken with the Water Resources Control Board, who are now reviewing a formal complaint. That got their attention. The angry-looking man spoke. You're threatening us with the state. No, I said calmly. I'm warning you that you're in violation of environmental law, property law, and potentially facing fines of over $50,000 if you don't remove that structure. The room tensed. Karen leaned back, her smile faltering. We'll have our lawyers reach out. You do that, I replied and turned to leave. Just know, the clock's already ticking. Back at home, I filed the formal complaint online, with the State Water Board attaching every document I had: survey images, construction, photos, maps, damage reports. I listed wetlands disruption, unauthorized shoreline construction, and violation of private property rights. Then I waited. 3 weeks passed. The structure continued to grow, now painted, furnished, landscaped, with imported stones and solar lighting. They even hosted a soft opening barbecue, with banners fluttering and kids running down the path I'd once cleared by hand. But the waiting ended on a Monday morning. I was in my garden, clipping back a vine, when a line of SUVs rolled up the old Hollis Road, 3 marked with state insignias, one with a drone operator in tow. It had begun. The SUVs parked in a line just outside the Meadow Hills entrance, engines idling in the early morning chill. The first to step out was a woman in a navy windbreaker, her ID badge catching the sun. Behind her came a trio of younger agents, clipboards and GPS equipment in hand, followed by a surveyor team and the drone operator already unfolding his gear. I didn't move from where I stood in the garden until the lead agent crossed onto my driveway. Mr. Davenport. I stood. That's me. Dana Keller, State Water Resources Control Board, she said, extending a firm hand. We received your complaint and supporting documents. We're conducting an on-site verification of alleged unauthorized shoreline development. Behind her, the others were already spreading out, moving along the tree line, unspooling orange, measuring tape, taking soil samples, mapping GPS points with rugged tablets. It was precise, silent, professional. The kind of inspection I used to lead myself. And it was all happening exactly where I'd said it should. I led Dana toward the north boundary, where the Meadow Hills Pavilion now stood in all its arrogant glory. Fresh cedar siding, oversized glass doors, and a polished deck that loomed directly over my lake. An HOA board member in a suit jacket, who I recognized as Thomas Reed, the angry one, came storming down the trail. You can't just walk in here like this, he shouted at the agents. This is private HOA property. Dana turned slowly. Sir, we're here under Section 162.4 of the State Water Protection Act. Your development is subject to review due to proximity to regulated water bodies and pending claims of land encroachment. Please do not interfere with official measurements. You don't even have a warrant, he snapped. Dana held up her tablet, flashing a digital version of the inspection order. We don't need a warrant for administrative review on undeveloped parcels with unresolved land disputes. The area in question is still under evaluation. Thomas fumed, jaw tight, hands balled into fists. Then, seeing the drone launch overhead, he turned and stormed off, muttering about lawyers. We spent the next hour walking the perimeter. Dana marked down each violation as we moved: unauthorized, grading, the removal of native vegetation, unpermitted construction within the 100-foot riparian setback zone, and most damning of all, the footprint of the pavilion, sitting 32 feet inside my deeded property line. She turned to me, jaw clenched. This isn't just a minor zoning oversight. This is willful overreach. I know, I said. They ignored every warning, and the county approved these permits. They submitted false parcel boundaries in their blueprints. No one double-checked. Her frown deepened. They will now. Over the next week, the inspection ballooned. State wetlands specialists arrived. A representative from the Department of Fish and Wildlife showed up with a water quality test kit. A soil erosion expert documented runoff patterns that were bleeding sediment into the fish spawning area I'd spent years maintaining. Even the county was forced to step in and open a code enforcement review. But the HOA doubled down. They launched a counter-narrative flyer sent to Meadow Hills residents painting me as a disgruntled old man hoarding a natural resource meant to be shared. Social media posts popped up, accusing me of trying to block community enrichment and spreading misinformation. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because 2 weeks after the inspection, a formal notice of violation was posted on the Meadow Hills Pavilion door. It was large laminated and printed on the signature yellow cardstock the state used for environmental enforcement notices. It listed 7 violations, 3 of which carried mandatory fines of up to $10,000 per day retroactive to the date of initial construction. The last line read, "Structure must be removed within 30 days of this notice. No appeal granted due to verified encroachment." The next HOA board meeting was different. They packed the sales center with concerned homeowners, and this time, I wasn't the outsider. People were angry, not at me, but at the board. Families who had bought into the Meadow Hills dream were now facing skyrocketing HOA dues to cover mounting legal fees and state penalties. I sat quietly in the back as Karen Holt tried to spin the situation. "We believe the state's overstepping. We're preparing legal action to challenge the demolition order." A man in the crowd shouted, "You built it on land that wasn't ours." A woman added, "You said it was community property. Why didn't anyone check the boundary?" Thomas Reed stood up, visibly sweating. "We were told the land wrapped around to the lake. The maps were unclear." I stood then, speaking softly but with weight. "They weren't unclear. They were wrong. And you were told multiple times before a single foundation was poured." Silence fell over the room. I've lived here 25 years. I've worked with the state. I protected this lake long before Meadow Hills existed. And I'll continue protecting it because what you did wasn't just foolish. It was arrogant. No one interrupted me, not even Karen. When I walked out, a few residents followed. One older couple offered quiet apologies. Another man asked if I could help him understand what rights he actually had regarding his lot. For the first time since this war began, I felt a shift not just in legal leverage, but in public perception. The HOA was cracking from the inside, and the clock on their demolition order was ticking down, 26 days left. You'd think that after a formal violation notice from the state, most people, especially an organization built on bylaws and rules, would take a hard pause and reassess their next move. Not the Meadow Hills HOA. Instead of acknowledging their mistake and beginning the required teardown, they doubled down in the most audacious way possible. They held a ribbon-cutting ceremony. I learned about it through a glossy flyer slipped under my gate latch. It featured a smiling Karen Holt posing in front of the pavilion with a large pair of scissors and a bright red ribbon stretched across the deck railings. The text underneath read, "Celebrate our vision. Meadow Hills Lake Pavilion grand opening Saturday at noon. Family fun, refreshments, live music." I stared at the flyer in disbelief, then turned it over. Printed in fine print at the bottom was a disclaimer. Pending resolution of regulatory matters. It was almost comical. I could have stopped them. Legally, I had grounds to file an injunction that would prohibit public events on a structure marked for demolition, but I didn't. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wanted the state officials to see the arrogance for themselves. There's a point when a paper violation becomes a public embarrassment, and Meadow Hills had just crossed it. Saturday came, and with it the full force of their delusion. Cars lined the road. HOA members in matching polos greeted guests with brochures. A bluegrass trio played on a makeshift stage set up on the lawn beside the pavilion. I watched from my property line as children ran up and down the path they'd illegally cleared through my tree line, now covered with temporary fencing and paper lanterns. I wasn't the only one watching. Midway through the event, 2 unmarked vehicles pulled into the lot. From them emerged Dana Keller and another officer from the State Water Board. They didn't interrupt the festivities. They observed, took notes, and captured photos from a distance. Later that evening, Dana called me. "They really threw a party," she said, dry amusement in her voice. "Told you they'd push it. We're escalating. Fines are now accruing daily. But more importantly, we're recommending a formal referral to the Attorney General's office for willful noncompliance. That includes criminal liability if it continues. That changed everything. On Monday, Meadow Hills' inboxes lit up. The state's official enforcement escalation letter was delivered via email and certified mail. It listed total fines accrued, now totaling $130,000, and outlined potential criminal consequences for continued public use of the illegal structure. The HOA board scrambled. Residents began demanding answers in the community Facebook group. Screenshots of the violations circulated, and so did angry comments. I thought we had legal rights to that deck. Why is my HOA fee being used to cover a fine? Did they even verify the land before building? HOA leadership tried to regain control with another flyer, this one far less glossy and far more desperate. It featured a vague apology and a promise to work cooperatively with all involved parties to reach a reasonable resolution. But it was too late. The narrative had shifted. The community no longer saw me as a stubborn old man standing in the way of their lake dreams. They saw the truth: their HOA had lied. Meanwhile, Karen Holt requested a meeting. We met at a picnic bench halfway between our properties. She arrived in a pressed dress shirt, holding a leather binder and a bottle of sparkling water. I wore my field jacket and brought only a yellow legal pad. Walter, she began using my first name like we were old friends. I want to start by saying we regret how things escalated. I said nothing. We believe there's still an opportunity to collaborate. Perhaps a joint maintenance agreement. Shared shoreline access in exchange for formal recognition of your deeded land. I raised an eyebrow. You're offering me access to my own lake. Karen blinked. I meant shared use. No, I said flatly. You don't get to use it. You don't get to build next to it. You don't even get to walk your dog near it. She swallowed. We're willing to pay a licensing fee. There's nothing you can offer me that's worth watching you tear down what you built. For the first time, she looked truly uncertain. So that's it? That's it! She closed the binder slowly. You know this won't look good for us. It already doesn't. As she stood to leave, I added, You were warned, Karen. I sent letters. I spoke at meetings. I showed up with documents. You ignored every single one of them. She paused, looking down at the gravel path. We thought you were bluffing. I nodded. Now you know. That night, floodlights lit up the construction site, not for expansion, but for documentation. Surveyors hired by the HOA returned to remeasure their parcel, hoping to find some technicality to cling to. They didn't. The line was clear, the encroachment undeniable. 2 days later, I received a knock at the door. It was a man in his 50s, shoulders slumped, holding a folded map and a clipboard. He introduced himself as Joseph Palmer, one of the Meadow Hills residents. Mr. Davenport, he said hesitantly. I was told you know a lot about property rights. I invited him in. Over coffee, he confessed that his own backyard seemed smaller than what was promised when he bought the lot. Turns out the HOA had marked boundaries based on planned plots, not actual surveys. I offered to walk the line with him, measure it together. We did. His suspicion was right. He was short by nearly 8 feet. That was the moment everything began to unravel for Meadow Hills. Word spread quickly. Residents began demanding third-party surveys. Discrepancies surfaced. Promised lot sizes didn't match deed filings. Some homes overlapped protected zones. The HOA's authority eroded not because of me, but because the very foundation of their trust had collapsed. They didn't just ignore my warnings. They ignored truth law and the wisdom of restraint. And now the consequences were compounding: one angry homeowner, one refund demand, one state letter at a time. After Joseph Palmer left my house that evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the overhead bulb casting a dim cone of light over a growing pile of maps, documents, and survey scans. What started as a battle for my shoreline was evolving into something much larger. A quiet unraveling of an empire built on paper promises and unchecked arrogance. I returned to my files, pulling out the older environmental assessments I had ordered back in 2001 when I first purchased the land. I found a scanned copy of the 1993 Regional Hydrology Report, the same one that documented the importance of the wetland buffer around my lake. Then I pulled the new drone photos from the state inspection and laid them side by side with an overhead image I had taken with my own drone a year before the HOA broke ground. The difference was stunning. Tree cover lost, shoreline erosion visible, and a noticeable silt plume where the lake once ran crystal clear. That plume was drifting directly into the fish spawning zone. That wasn't just an aesthetic loss. It was an ecological offense. One that, if documented properly, would place Meadow Hills in violation of both the HOA State Surface Water Protection Code and the Endangered Habitats Act. Given that the lake's frogs and fish were considered regionally sensitive, the gears turned faster in my head. This was no longer just about property lines. This was a potential environmental crime scene. So I called someone I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. His name was Marcus Hale, a former colleague from my DEP days, who now worked as an environmental impact assessor for a consulting firm contracted by the state. We hadn't talked much since retirement, but when he picked up and heard my voice, he let out a familiar chuckle. "Walter, I had a feeling you'd resurface someday, so what's lit the fire?" "An HOA built a deck on my lake," I said. "But they also tore up protected wetland to do it. And I've got the pictures to prove it." He grew serious. "You have baseline data." "I do. Historical reports, satellite images, species, inventory, the works. Want to come see for yourself." By noon the next day, Marcus was on my dock, digital tablet in hand, his salt and pepper ponytail tied back like always. We walked the edge of the pavilion, the illegal launch ramp, and the spots where topsoil had been scraped away and replaced with decorative stone. He knelt, scooped up a sample of the silt-darkened water, and sniffed. "That's construction runoff," he muttered. "And that over there, that's bulldozed cattail habitat." Jesus, Walter. "Still think I'm overreacting?" He stood his jaw tight. "No, I think this is about to get serious." He filed his own independent report that same week. I never asked him what it said. I didn't have to. I knew Marcus, he was as thorough as they came. Behind the scenes, I compiled a master dossier, a labeled binder that outlined the HOA's missteps in exacting detail. I included the chronological timeline of violations, photos, scans, side-by-side imagery, and quotes from the HOA's own promotional materials that clearly promised access to shared lakeside amenities. I even added screenshots of their social media advertisements that used drone photos of my lake as marketing tools. I printed 3 copies. One I kept. One I mailed to the State Attorney General's office. The third I delivered quietly and without ceremony to the local ABC affiliate news station. I didn't ask for coverage. I didn't write a dramatic letter. I just left it in the mailbox with a sticky note that said, "If you want a real story about HOA corruption and environmental abuse, start here. WD." Then I waited. Meanwhile, Meadow Hills was still trying to salvage their image. They held emergency meetings and hired a PR firm, which issued carefully worded statements blaming the issue on contractor miscommunication. But internally, the panic was spreading. I knew this not from gossip, but from a growing number of knocks on my door. Each one brought a different face. A mother of 3, who wanted to know if her fence really encroached on public easement. A young couple who learned their foundation had been poured 5 feet into the setback zone. A retired veteran whose lot had no recorded access road despite assurances in his contract. "I don't know what to believe anymore," one woman whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched her property map. I did. I believed Meadow Hills had lied to everyone. So I helped. I printed maps, highlighted survey lines, showed residents how to request public records. I became the unofficial land rights consultant of Alderwood County. Word got out, and people began meeting in my yard on Saturday mornings, folding chairs, circling under the oaks, thermoses of coffee, and legal pads in hand. We weren't angry protesters. We were just neighbors who wanted the truth, and it wasn't coming from the HOA. It was during one of these meetings that I received a phone call I hadn't expected. "Mr. Davenport, this is Julia Moran from Channel 8 News. We received your packet. Is this a good time to talk?" I stepped away from the group and nodded. "It is." She continued, "I'm going to be blunt. This story has legs. Between the state violation orders, the wetland destruction, and the misrepresentation of property lines, this could go statewide. But we'll need you on camera." I paused. "I'm not looking for fame," I said. "Not fame," she replied. "Credibility." I agreed to an interview, but only on one condition: they speak with affected residents as well. I wasn't the hero of this story. I was just the first domino. The real damage was felt by those who had trusted a system built on fraud. That following Thursday, the segment aired. The headline: "Lake Lies, HOA Faces Backlash Over Illegal Construction and Land Misuse." There I was, sitting on my dock, pointing toward the now quiet pavilion with its padlocked doors and the bright yellow state seal posted on its side. The camera panned over drone footage of the destroyed tree line, the eroded shoreline, and the crowded Meadow Hills meeting where residents shouted down the board. The fallout was immediate. The HOA's board inboxes crashed from incoming complaints. Their legal firm quietly dropped them as clients. Real estate agents began removing the words lake access from listings. Property values dipped. And somewhere buried in the state legal offices, my formal request for permanent conservation designation of my shoreline advanced to the top of the stack. Everything was in motion now, not through noise, not through rage, but through steady, quiet pressure. The envelope was heavier than I expected. Thick paper wax seal from the state's Office of Land and Water Affairs, and my name etched on the front in the kind of font only bureaucrats or royalty would use. I slid it open with my old DEP field knife and pulled out the contents slowly, almost ceremonially. Inside was the official acknowledgement the state of Alderwood had received, reviewed, and opened a formal investigation based on the complaint I had filed. It named the Meadow Hills Homeowners Association as the subject of a multi-tiered review regarding property, encroachment, ecological violation, and misrepresentation of development claims. Attached were two more documents, one granting temporary protected status to the wetland buffer zone around my lake, and another signed by the Deputy Attorney General. The AG was opening a case file. For the first time since the first survey flag appeared in my woods, I let out a long, unguarded breath. This was real now. It was no longer a quiet boundary fight between a retired conservation officer and a smug HOA board. It was the full weight of state machinery rumbling into motion, slow and deliberate, but with force that could not be ignored. The news broke before I had a chance to process it. Channel 8 ran a follow-up story. This time they showed the full drone footage, the scorched tree lines, the pavilion's now deserted deck furniture, and the large signs installed by the state that read, "Do not enter. Structure under legal review. State protected area." Residents from Meadow Hills were shown in quick interviews. Some expressed shock, others anger. "I just want to know why we weren't told," a young father said, holding his toddler on his hip. They kept insisting this was legal. I trusted them. "It's embarrassing," an older woman said. "We told our friends we had lakefront access. Now look at this." The board, unsurprisingly, refused interviews. Karen Holt released a boilerplate statement blaming the entire fiasco on miscommunication between developers, contractors, and third-party surveyors. It was a weak move, and people saw through it. In the weeks that followed, my phone rang nearly every evening. Residents who had once ignored me or even publicly criticized me were now seeking my advice. I helped them the best I could. I wasn't a lawyer, but I understood land law better than most attorneys I'd met. I helped one couple file a request for boundary verification. I assisted another family in preparing their demand letter for a refund on an HOA-imposed landscaping fine issued based on incorrect property lines. It felt like the neighborhood was waking up. One Thursday, I received an email from a junior policy advisor with the State Environmental Integrity Commission. She asked for a meeting. "I've been tasked with reviewing Mr. Hale's assessment report," she wrote. "And yours, Mr. Davenport. The AG's office forwarded your dossier for internal environmental auditing." We met at the county planning building. Her name was Naomi Choi, sharp-eyed and soft-spoken, with a tenacity that reminded me of a young field agent I once mentored. She opened our meeting with one sentence, "Walter, I think this is bigger than, you know." She laid out the state's findings so far. The pavilion encroachment was just the beginning. Several other structures within the Meadow Hills development had encroached on greenbelt buffer zones. The lake's Inmar northern watershed, what used to be dense thickets of naturally regenerating trees, had been illegally cleared, likely to enhance resale views. What's more, drainage from a poorly built retention pond near the clubhouse was leaching fertilizer-rich water directly into the lake, triggering algae blooms. This wasn't just negligence, Naomi said. It was a systematic attempt to create a resort-style aesthetic without any regard for local ordinances or the long-term environmental cost. I felt a chill. How much of that can be proven? Enough, she said, tapping her folder. And we're not done yet. That afternoon, I was called into a private meeting with 2 attorneys from the AG's office. They reviewed my submission, cross-checked witness accounts from the residents, and asked if I would be willing to provide testimony if this moved to litigation. I've been testifying in court since the 80s, I said. If it gets that far, I'll be ready. They smiled and nodded. It wasn't lost on me that what had started as an HOA headache was now a matter under potential criminal review. A few days later, I took a walk around the lake, something I hadn't done in weeks. I followed the old path that looped around the water's edge, still overgrown, but peaceful. When I reached the spot directly opposite the pavilion, I paused. There it stood, silent now. No music, no flyers, no chatter from future homeowners sipping wine on launch day. Just empty railings and a structure waiting to be erased. I found a smooth rock and skipped it across the surface of the lake, just like I used to do when I first moved in. The ripples spread outward, slow and graceful. Everything they had built, the lies, the arrogance, the manipulation, had been a splash. But what I had built, the foundation of truth, documentation, and quiet patience, was a wave. By mid-month, Meadow Hills' lawyers attempted a settlement. They sent a letter via courier offering me a confidential agreement. They would pay me a community easement fee, offer a public apology, and consider removing the pavilion at a future date pending environmental assessment. I laughed when I read it. No apology could erase the scars they left on the land. No check could repair the erosion or bring back the frogs that had stopped calling in the night. This wasn't about compromises anymore. It was about justice and consequences. So I responded with my own letter. One line. The deadline for voluntary removal has passed. My patience has not. A week later, the state issued a final enforcement letter. The structure was to be demolished. All disturbed land restored under state supervision. Fines would continue until completion. No further appeals would be accepted. I sat on my porch that evening, wind rustling through the trees that still stood. In the distance, I heard the faint beeping of construction trucks reversing. But this time they weren't building. They were preparing to take it all down. The first piece to fall was the deck railing. I watched from my screened-in porch as a pair of workers in hard hats unscrewed the cedar slats one by one, stacking them in neat, silent piles like coffins for a failed idea. The demolition order had landed with the weight of law. And this time there were no more clever statements, no ribbon cuttings, no cheerful flyers in pastel tones. Just silence, sawdust, and the slow collapse of a fantasy built on arrogance. Meadow Hills HOA didn't make an announcement. They didn't warn residents. One morning, the trucks just arrived. A backhoe, a flatbed for hauling off debris, a porta-potty dropped near the trail, a foreman with an orange vest, and a clipboard pacing up and down the construction tape with the energy of someone who didn't want to be there. By the second day, the windows of the pavilion were gone. The door stood open, framing an empty echo where furniture had once sat. Someone had left behind a folding chair and a cooler. That too was carried off like it never mattered. And all across the neighborhood, people were watching. I walked into town that afternoon for groceries, and someone called out to me from across the parking lot. It was Mrs. Rojas, a Meadow Hills homeowner I'd met just once before. "They're tearing it down, Mr. Davenport," she said, almost breathless. "You really did it." I didn't correct her. It wasn't just me. The state had enforced it. The residents had spoken. The truth had surfaced. I'd simply lit the first match. Inside the store, 3 other people nodded at me. One man even patted me on the shoulder. It was strange being seen like this, not as the reclusive guy who lived by the lake, but as something more. A neighbor who fought back. A reminder that rules matter and so does standing your ground. But the spotlight wasn't always friendly. That evening, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. "This is Greg Turner," the voice said, "from the HOA's legal counsel." I didn't respond. "I'm calling to inform you that our clients believe the state's enforcement process was influenced by biased reporting and incomplete documentation. They are considering a civil countersuit." I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the lake. "Greg, you're welcome to file whatever you like. But I'd advise you to read the state's findings first. They didn't just act on my complaint. They acted on photographic, topographical, and ecological evidence gathered by multiple agencies. If you want to test that in court, be my guest." He paused. My clients believe you've encouraged public hysteria. I chuckled. No, I encouraged due process. The hysteria came from your clients thinking they were above the law. He ended the call without another word. The next morning, Channel 8 showed up at my gate. Not a full crew, just Julia Moran, the reporter who had first broken the story, and a young cameraman. She was polite, standing on the gravel path like someone visiting a gravesite. Mr. Davenport, do you have a comment on the demolition underway? I considered her question, then nodded slowly. Just this, I said. The land remembers what you do to it, and it doesn't care if you were trying to raise property values. She blinked, then smiled faintly. That's poetic. It's the truth. Later that week, I received a formal letter from the Alderwood County Council. It wasn't printed on legal letterhead or written in legalese. Just a single page that read, Dear Mr. Davenport, the Council would like to thank you for your dedication to preserving the ecological and legal integrity of our county's natural resources. Your efforts have not gone unnoticed. We've begun reviewing other lakeside developments for compliance based on the standards you helped reinforce. We would be honored to meet with you if you're ever interested in serving in an advisory capacity on future conservation initiatives. Respectfully, Monica Bell County Chair. I folded the letter and set it beside my mug. For a long time, I didn't move. I didn't need a plaque or an award. I didn't even need thanks. But that letter felt like closure. Still, Meadow Hills wasn't done falling apart. An anonymous tip, likely from a disgruntled former employee, leaked internal HOA communications to the press. Emails revealed that the board had known months in advance that the land in question belonged to me. They had banked on a legal loophole, believing that once the structure was in place, I'd be pressured into a settlement or forced to concede access under community use claims. It was a gamble, and they'd lost. Residents began calling for resignations. A special meeting was held in the elementary school gymnasium to vote on the future of the board. Karen Holt never showed. Neither did Thomas Reed. By the end of the night, the board was dissolved pending a new election. More than a dozen families filed for refunds on assessments related to the pavilion. At least 4 announced plans to sell and move elsewhere. Real estate listings began to drop the word Meadow Hills entirely. And through it all, I stayed quiet. I didn't gloat. I didn't give speeches. I just kept walking my land, restoring the trail where the construction trucks had rolled through, replanting young trees, where the roots had been torn up. It took 4 days to fully remove the pavilion. When the last board was hauled away, I stood on the lakeshore, hands in my pockets, and watched the empty foundation shimmer under the afternoon sun. All that remained was scarred earth, a few scattered nails, and the sound of water lapping against untouched rock. Later that evening, a little boy I didn't recognize biked up to my gate. He hesitated, then pointed toward the lake. My mom says that's yours, he said. It's really pretty. I smiled. Yes, it is. He nodded, then asked, Can I draw it sometime for school? Anytime you want, I replied. Because now, finally, it was just a lake again. Mine. The demolition order arrived like thunder, without lightning silent on the horizon, until it broke open the sky. Dated and signed by the State Office of Environmental Enforcement, it was concise, direct, and utterly final. The Meadow Hills Pavilion was to be removed entirely within 30 days of receipt. No appeals, no extensions, and no further hearings would be granted. Failure to comply would result in escalating daily fines and potential criminal referrals. I sat with the letter in my lap, letting the gravity of it soak into the silence of my home. There was no joy in it, no smug satisfaction. Just the hollow relief of a man who had spent years defending things that couldn't speak for themselves, lakes, trees, wetlands, boundaries each with no voice of their own, except for mine. The news broke publicly 3 days later. Channel 8 aired the announcement during their evening segment. Julia Moran's voice came in calm and measured over images of the once pristine pavilion, now cordoned off with yellow state tape. The state of Alderwood has ordered the complete demolition of the Meadow Hills Lake Pavilion, citing flagrant violations of property boundaries and environmental codes. The homeowners association responsible has been given 30 days to dismantle the structure or face mounting legal and financial penalties. The camera lingered on the building, silent and still under a steel gray sky. Then it cut to a clip of Naomi Choi, the state environmental policy analyst, standing beside the lake during a press briefing. "This is not just about private property," she said into the microphone. "It's about ecological integrity. It's about the law. And it's about what happens when people believe their ambition can override their obligation to truth." It was everything I'd been trying to say, but coming from a voice with power, with reach. That night, the HOA board met behind closed doors. They issued no public statement, no apology. But the following morning, the trucks began to arrive, not contractors in polo shirts, but state-certified deconstruction crews. These were men and women in safety vests, with hard faces and state-mandated checklists. Their mission wasn't to build dreams, but to take them apart. Residents gathered quietly along the trail that morning, murmuring among themselves. Some held coffee. A few took photos. I stood farther back, arms crossed, watching the first beams come down. Someone behind me muttered, "They really thought they could just take it." Another voice replied, "They thought he wouldn't fight." A woman turned to me, then an older resident I didn't know. She gave a faint nod, eyes misty. "Thank you," she said. Just that. I didn't answer. Instead, I returned to my property, crossed the threshold of the tree line, and began walking the stretch where their construction crew had once laid illegal gravel over my roots. I knelt, placed my hand on the soil. It was still bruised, but healing. Over the following days, I documented the demolition. Not out of spite, but out of duty. I took photographs, cataloged progress, and compiled a new binder, a sort of mirror to the first one this time, showing restoration. It was important to me, for some reason, to see the dismantling just as carefully as I had tracked the destruction. Midway through the process, I received a letter from the Department of Conservation. They were officially approving my petition to designate the shoreline around my lake as a privately managed conservation zone. A classification that carried state protections, funding for maintenance, and recognition of the land's ecological value. It also meant that no future development could ever be approved within 100 feet of the shoreline. Permanent peace. I pinned the certificate beside my framed property deed. But as the pavilion came down, something else went up, a slow panic within Meadow Hills. The HOA board had become ghosts, barely seen, barely heard. Rumors of lawsuits brewed beneath the surface. Real estate agents canceled open houses. Contractors refused new projects tied to HOA funding. One homeowner told me in a hushed voice that her dues had quietly doubled to cover legal contingencies. Another said she'd stopped paying altogether, and no one had followed up. The community was unraveling, not with rage, but with resignation. Quietly, house by house, the truth had arrived, and with it, the realization that they'd all been pawns in a bigger lie. I received another knock at the door that week, this time from a young man in a maintenance uniform with a clipboard and sheepish eyes. "Mr. Davenport?" he asked. "I've been hired to help with shoreline cleanup. They said you might have instructions." I invited him in, poured him water, and opened the binder of photos I'd taken of the undisturbed shoreline before the pavilion went up. "You're going to help me make it look like this again," I said. He looked over the images, eyes widening. "This was beautiful." "It still is," I replied. "We just need to listen to it again." Together, we began replanting. Not with decorative shrubs or imported grass, but with native sedges, low-lying ferns, and wildflowers that once bloomed freely by the water. I showed him where to clear invasive species, how to layer mulch to encourage frogs to return, and how to read the subtle cues of erosion patterns. He listened. He learned. And in that process, I found something I hadn't expected to feel again: hope. The last piece of the pavilion was hauled off on a rainy Friday. Just before dusk, I walked down to where it had stood. The platform was gone. The beams were gone. Even the gravel path had been dug up and replaced with loose soil and straw to prevent runoff. I stood alone in the clearing, the sky drizzling on my shoulders, and let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The fight was over. They didn't go quietly. The final stages of the demolition weren't even cold before the backlash began. Not from the state, not from the county, but from the Meadow Hills HOA board members themselves. Disgraced, disempowered, and desperate, they launched their last act, not with lawyers or bulldozers, but with something far more insidious: a targeted campaign to rewrite the narrative. It started with a slick website, meadowhillsfacts.org, complete with glossy images of the pavilion in its prime testimonials from select residents, and a timeline that twisted the truth until it almost looked reasonable. They painted themselves as visionaries, undone by red tape, and retired obstructionists. According to their version, the pavilion had been a gift to the community torn down because of an embittered neighbor with too much time and too little goodwill. I wasn't named directly, of course, but the subtext was clear. Photos of the lake taken from my dock were used without permission, coupled with captions like, "This shoreline was once open to all, now closed by bureaucracy." Then came the opinion pieces. Local newspapers received letters signed by concerned Meadow Hills families, lamenting the loss of shared space, questioning the validity of the state's enforcement, and even accusing environmental regulators of overreach. One letter called it a cautionary tale about what happens when a single landowner holds an entire community hostage. I read that one twice. The irony stung, but the smear didn't surprise me. People with power rarely surrender it without slinging mud on their way out. Still, the real blow came when I received a certified letter this time. Not from a law firm, but from the newly reconstituted Meadow Hills HOA board, a group of interim members hastily elected after the previous regime resigned in disgrace. The letter expressed deep concern over the reputational harm done to the community and asked if I would consider engaging in a restorative dialogue to heal divisions. I closed the envelope and set it aside. Not out of contempt, but because I knew the difference between real reconciliation and image control. This wasn't an olive branch. It was a press release waiting to happen. But not everyone had bought into the board's version of events. One morning, as I was watering the young ferns we'd replanted along the shoreline, a man I didn't recognize walked up the trail. He was tall, mid-30s, wearing a backpack and holding a camera. "Mr. Davenport," he asked. I nodded. "I'm Ben Riker from Lakeside Journal. I'm doing a long-form piece on community conflict and land use. I've spoken to state officials, some Meadow Hills residents, even former board members, but I'd like to hear from you on the record." I hesitated. I was tired. Not physically, but deeply inwardly tired of being the only one trying to tell the truth while others spun their own to fit whatever narrative they needed to sleep at night. But something about Ben's tone, low, thoughtful, unhurried, nudged me. We sat on my porch for nearly 2 hours. He didn't interrupt. He didn't paraphrase. He just listened. I told him everything from the first survey flags to the final truck hauling away the last timber of the pavilion. I showed him the documents, the photos, the state letters. And when I was done, he asked only one question. "What would you tell someone in your position 5 years from now?" I looked out at the lake. I'd tell them to write everything down. Document everything. And remember that the law is slow, but when it moves like bedrock. His article ran 2 weeks later, titled, "The Quiet Man and the Crumbling HOA, How a Lake Fought Back." It was devastating. He exposed the internal emails that had been leaked. He quoted state regulators who confirmed the environmental violations were among the most blatant they'd seen in years. He interviewed residents who now admitted they had been misled from the start. But more than that, he painted a picture of a man, me, not as a cranky recluse, but as someone who simply refused to be erased. And that, I think, was the final blow. The website disappeared within days. meadowhillsfacts.org was taken offline with no explanation. Social media posts vanished. The remaining board members stopped issuing statements. Even the interim president, who had tried so hard to appear neutral, quietly stepped down. The HOA still existed on paper. There were still dues, still bylaws. But the soul of it, whatever pride or illusion of leadership had once defined, it was gone. What replaced it was smaller, slower, more humble. Neighbors began reaching out not to fight, but to help. One woman brought a basket of native wildflower seeds and asked if she could scatter them near the trail. A teenage boy offered to help clear debris from the storm that had blown through the previous night. A couple from 3 streets over brought me fresh eggs and asked if I'd help them install a rainwater collection barrel like the one you showed on TV. I said yes to all of it, because the only thing stronger than outrage is healing. And healing is slow, like soil rebuilding itself after a fire. That summer, frogs returned to the lake. I heard them first, soft, tentative croaks in the reeds near the western shore. Then more. By August, the nightly chorus had returned layered and complex, just as I remembered it from years before. One night, I sat out on the dock, long after sunset, bare feet, dangling above the water. The moonlight danced across the ripples. In the distance, I saw a single lantern glow from a neighboring porch. For a moment, everything was still. The lake had been taken from me. Then it had been fought for. Now, finally, it had been given back. Fall came slowly to Alderwood County, the kind of season that didn't announce itself in loud bursts of red and gold, but in quiet signs, the steady thinning of leaves, the shift in birdsong, the way the lake's morning mist lingered just a little longer each day. It had been nearly a year since I spotted those first fluorescent survey flags in my woods, nearly a year since peace had been cracked open and everything changed. But change, I had learned, wasn't always destruction. Sometimes it was a clearing. The pavilion was gone. The HOA had crumbled and reshaped itself into something quieter, more accountable. And I had settled into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. My mornings were spent walking the perimeter of the lake, checking the health of the wetland plants we'd restored. The sedges had taken root. The cattails had returned. Frogs called each other across the shallows, their rhythms rising and falling like ancient songs stitched into water. People still came sometimes, in twos or threes, sometimes just one walking the trail with quiet reverence. They never crossed the boundaries. They knew now. Some carried notebooks, others took photos. But they were gentle, respectful. And that was enough for me. One Saturday in October, I was invited to speak at the county's Land and Resource Forum, a semi-annual event that usually featured policy wonks and soil experts. I declined twice. But Naomi Choi called me personally. "Walter," she said gently, "you don't have to give a speech, just tell your story. People need to hear how these things start and how they can end." So I did. I stood at a wooden podium in a small auditorium filled with folding chairs and planners with clipboards. I wore my field jacket, the same one I'd worn when I first confronted the HOA. I didn't bring slides or charts. I just spoke. I never wanted to fight, I began. I just wanted to be left in peace. I told them about the survey flags, the bulldozers, the stone path cut through Cattail Marsh. I described the smell of overturned soil, the quiet panic of watching something you love get smothered by ambition. And then I told them about the frogs returning, about the kids planting wildflowers, about how something broken could still be healed. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then came applause, not raucous, not dramatic, just genuine. Afterwards, a young woman approached me. She was a land use consultant from another county notebook full of scribbles. "Would you ever consider writing about all of this?" she asked. "Not just for regulators, for people, for homeowners, for communities trying to protect what they have." I considered it, maybe. In the months that followed, I began keeping more detailed journals, not just of the legal documents and maps, but of feelings, moments, images. The way the light touched the water in October. The exact day the first frog laid eggs again. The questions that kids asked. When they joined me for shoreline walks, do dragonflies sleep? Can trees talk to each other? Why are mushrooms always hiding? That last one stuck with me. Why are mushrooms always hiding? Maybe because they grow in silence, in shadow, until the time is right. And when they surface, they remind us that beauty doesn't always come loudly. By winter, I had started a small community group, nothing formal, just monthly gatherings in my barn with hot cider chairs in a circle and conversations about stewardship. We called it the Shoreline Circle. Members came from other neighborhoods, farms, even the city. Some had fought their own land battles. Others just wanted to listen. And through it all, the lake remained constant, not untouched, but respected. One cold evening, as I walked back from the dock, I saw a familiar silhouette waiting at my porch. Marcus Hale, my old friend from the Department of Environmental Protection, hands in his coat pockets. "I heard about your forum speech," he said with a grin. "You're practically a folk hero now." I snorted. "Hardly. I'm just the guy who said no and meant it." We sat inside, shared a whiskey, and looked through the binder one last time. The photos of the pavilion, the letters, the news clippings, all now frozen artifacts of something that felt like another life. "You ever think you'd be doing this after retirement?" he asked. "Not in a million years." He raised his glass. "To quiet men who don't stay quiet." I raised mine back. To land that remembers. Later, long after he'd left, I returned to the porch. The lake glimmered faintly beneath a pale moon, still and waiting. And for the first time in a long while, I felt not like someone who'd defended something, but like someone who'd been invited to live beside it again. Not because I fought, but because I stayed. And in staying, I reminded others that peace is not passive. It's earned, tended, and protected. Just like a lake, just like the truth.